Hey, everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at the logic behind John Maynard Keynes' theory that transformed economic thought in the beginning parts of the 20th century and really challenged all of the neoclassical assumptions that have been in place before. What's clear is that you got to get the logic in your head, first of all, that Keynesian thought is a reaction to the neoclassical model. So neoclassical stuff is first. That's like based on Adam Smith's ideas. Keynes is second. And Keynes is living in a post-industrialized world where he's looking around and he's seeing things very differently than what Adam Smith saw when he was developing his ideas in 1776 when the world wasn't really industrialized yet. Okay. Secondly, Keynesian's logic is kind of hard to get in your head unless you build a story behind it. So I've made up this story that I'll tell you here in a second. Okay, but the big idea here is Keynes's logic is all about the buildup of capacity in an economy, a crash, and then the reality of the spare capacity that exists as a result of the buildup before. Let's take a look. Keynes' theory is all based on the notion that spare capacity has already been built up in the economy. Don't forget that, ever. That is the basis of Keynes' story. Okay? So I want to introduce you to a young couple named Mark and Margaret. There they are. To tell you the story about it's all about the building up of spare capacity. There they are. Oh, how cute. There's Mark. There's Margaret. They've gotten married and they built a house all by themselves, and here they are. They live in this house. Now join me in the story of this young couple of Mark and Margaret to understand Keynes' theory of macroeconomics. Here we go. So Mark and Margaret are a couple. They build a house, right? And after the first year or so of marriage, what happens? Well, lo and behold, they have a child. And so, in order to take care of this child adequately to the way that they want, they build a nice little room off the side of their house, and there is their beautiful daughter living in their new room. And isn't it so cute? Look at them. There's the happy couple, and they have their new young child. And then, after another couple years, they have another child. Oh, how sweet, another girl. Look, and they spent all the money over here to build a new room for their second daughter. And there she is, all happy. And there's Mark and Margaret, and they're all happy. And now they have the capacity to have two children in the house. And then another couple years pass, and what happens? You guessed it, they had a third child. So they built the second floor to their house off to the side here. They reconstructed the roof, and now they're a family of five living in a 4-bedroom house. They got their third daughter's bedroom, their second daughter's bedroom, and their first daughter's bedroom. Of course, Mark and Margaret live in the main room of the house. But then, after a couple years, wouldn't you know, they had their fourth child. Okay, so here's the family of 6. And Mark and Margaret have spent all of the money that they needed in order to build in the capacity to have 1, 2, 3, 4 children. But time goes by, and what happens? Their first child goes off to the university, and now they're left with their second, third, and fourth child, but the room for their first child is now empty. And a couple years passes, and guess what happens? You got it. Their second child goes off to university, and now they have 2 empty rooms, and their third and fourth child are now in high school, and then they're headed towards graduation, and their third child, daughter, graduates from high school, and what do you know that happens? She's gone too. And then after a couple more years, their last child gets all A's, gets a 7 on the IB exam, heads off to the London School of Economics, and Mark and Margaret are are left all alone in their big 6-bedroom house by themselves. It only has 5 bedrooms, actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now all the kids are gone, And Mark and Margaret, they're traveling the world and doing all this silly stuff that everybody dreams of. And then all of a sudden they get a call one day and their first daughter wants to move back into the house. And they say, "Oh, honey, that would be great. Please come back because it'd be really easy for you to move in. It wouldn't cost us any money at all. Just come on home." And their daughter says, "Great, I will." And there she is, post-college graduate, moving back into the house. But guess what? Did Mark and Margaret have to spend any money in order to allow their first daughter to come back? No. Why not? Well, because Mark and Margaret had already built up the capacity in their house to house their first daughter. Again, she just came back in. There's no additional cost to Mark and Margaret because they had already built that room years ago. Well, as younger siblings may do, guess what happens? The second child says, "Hey, Mom, Dad, can I move back home?" And she does. Look, there she is. Did Mark and Margaret have to spend any more money in order for their second daughter to come home? No. Why? Because there's spare capacity in the house by the fact that they have already spent the money to build that room. And then the third daughter calls and is like, "Man, I want to hang out with my sisters." So after she graduates from the university, she moves in home. She moves back home too. And then a couple years later, you guessed it, the fourth daughter comes back home, and Mark and Margaret, look at them. They look like they haven't aged at all, except now they're in their 50s, but their house is full again. But guess what? To go from having 0 kids and then all 4 of them moving back in after the university, Mark and Margaret didn't have to spend any money. And the reason they didn't have to spend any money is that they had already built up the capacity in their house to house 4 people, 4 children. So the point here is the only reason that when Mark and Margaret's 4 daughters came back from the university, the only reason they didn't have to spend more money is the fact that they had already spent that money earlier in their lifetime as they were raising their young children. So Mark and Margaret's house is now back to the same capacity that it was before their first daughter went off to the university. But guess what happens? As happens with all families, they continue to grow as the younger generation gets older. And look at what happens. Mark and Margaret become grandparents as their first child has their first daughter. But guess what? All that spare capacity was actually used up. So when they have their first grandchild, Mark and Margaret are actually going to have to spend some more money. So their costs have risen. And then, guess what happens? You guessed it. Another daughter has a child, and that child moves in, and guess what? They had to spend more money to build this house, so their costs are rising. For their grandchildren, all of their costs are going up, and then they have another grandchild, and then they have a fourth grandchild, but that's it. Mark and Margaret have no more room. They have built their house into a how many bedrooms is this? A 9-bedroom palace. It's taking up all of the square footage of their yard. They cannot build anymore. There's all these zoning codes. They have met their potential growth line. Why? Because there's no more available space for the Mark and Margaret family to expand. What would they have to do? They would have to figure out some massive change to increase the overall capacity of their entire land usage. Okay, so what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that the second part, when Mark and Margaret started becoming grandparents, they actually had to start building more housing, more rooms for their grandkids, right? So hold on to that whole idea, okay? It was to build up the family, then the kids went off to the university, then they came back. And when they came back, there really wasn't any sort of big new costs that Mark and Margaret had to endure in order to have their 4 daughters move back in with them. But once they started having grandchildren, their costs started going up. Then they got to a point, which is where they are here, where now they have 4 grandchildren, they have a 9-bedroom house, and that's it. There's no more potential growth available to them on this particular plot of land. Okay, so what's the point of telling you this story? The story is critical to you understanding what Keynes was saying about the growth of economies and the notion that whence there is spare capacity in an economy, that spare capacity allows for an increase of growth after a crash without any rise in costs. Just like Mark and Margaret, when they had their first daughter and second daughter and third daughter and fourth daughter come back to them after the university, because they had built up all of the rooms prior to them leaving for the university, they didn't have to incur any additional costs. Okay, that is the parable. The story of the young couple, Mark and Margaret, becoming newlyweds and on to grandparents. Now, what on earth does this have to do with Keynes and some graph? Check it out. All right, the Keynesian macroeconomic aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve starts off with an image like this, okay? And what I want you to think about is that this graph, this is an aggregate supply curve. This is the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. And you notice it's fairly peculiar in that it's completely flat or horizontal, then it curves upward, and then it goes totally vertical. Okay. So what does this say? Well, it says that at certain portions of this aggregate supply curve, average price levels will not change. At another portion, there will be a correlated, what that means is that average price levels will not change as real output goes out. So as you move along this line, notice that the average price levels are staying the same, but output is increasing. Okay. But then you get to another region of this curve, part 2, region 2, which it says that, well, as output increases, there actually will be a rise in average price levels until you get to a certain point where you're maxed out. There can be no more output. All there is a rise in costs, and it just goes straight up in the air, perfectly inelastic. Okay, so have an idea in your mind about that curve because it's really quite important for you to understand, okay, as you begin to understand the logic behind Keynes. So now I've added a couple aggregate demand curves, and this is just sort of the beginning of the story of what you need to know in terms of studying economics, about understanding what Keynes said. What happens in the Keynesian theory is that there's some stuff that's happened before his ideas are relevant, and that is basically that an economy has built up its resources to a point where it's an industrialized society. Okay, so over time, aggregate demand, aggregate supply have worked together to have this output and this average price level. Okay, so imagine sort of the beginning of the story being here, which is exactly where Mark and Margaret were right before their kids went off to university. Think of it that way. At this point right here, okay, this equilibrium point of real output YF and PL1 is where we pick up with the story of Mark and Margaret with full capacity in their house. What have they done? They've built 4 additional bedrooms. They have 4 daughters, right? Throughout the creation of all that, they spent all of this money in order to build those homes. Aggregate demand was way up because they had 1 child, then 2 child, then 3 child, then 4 children. And as a result, you get up to a point where you're operating right here. The output of the house is here, and all of the costs of building that house are here. In an economy, this is where Keynes starts because this is an industrialized society, and all of this effort has been put into building factories and all of the inputs and capital expenditures that would be involved in an industrialized society. Okay, then the kids take off and go to college. And the best way to think about it in terms of like relating it to the story of Mark and Margaret, just imagine like if all the kids left at once. There's a massive crash in aggregate demand in the household, and it would look something like this. Right? All of that demand all of a sudden vanishes. And the output of the house ends up being somewhere in the neighborhood of like Y1 right here. Okay? So that's where Mark and Margaret were when they had lost all their children and their children have gone off to the university, right? And the aggregate demand in their house had dropped because they're not buying food for 6 people now. They're just buying food for 2. Okay. So think about it though. They're gone now. Now, this is what Keynes said. This is like think of the Great Depression. There's a massive economic crisis. And what does that mean? It means average price levels have dropped. It means that output has completely fallen off. And you know from your studies, like this is representative also of like massive unemployment too. We of course have deflation, so unemployment and deflation, and there's a massive economic crisis, a depression. Okay, so aggregate demand after the depression we're in the bottom of the depression, or Mark and Margaret's story, like no one's in the house. What Keynes said is that you can actually demand can come up, right, to say here, and the output in the economy can increase to say Y2, but unlike the neoclassical model, what happened? There's no increased cost to firms because that capacity was already there. This is the equivalent of like one child coming back from the university. The economy has built up this capacity. So imagine if there's like 100 empty factories that are just sitting there. They have all the machinery in them, but they haven't been used because demand has dropped, which means that output has dropped. But then all of a sudden demand goes up. Well, a firm who has those factories can just simply hire workers, put them in there, and they don't have to build anything. They just occupy it. And if there's a really big economic depression, they can pay the workers whatever they want. A worker will take a job at a low rate if they've been out of work for a long time. So what Keynes said is there's no actually rise in the average price level because there's no rise in the actual cost to firms because they've already built up the capacity. And what Keynes said is that could happen for a while. And in fact, it happens all the way along the perfectly horizontal part of this aggregate supply curve, and that output will increase up until a point where that capacity is met. Well, that's just like the first, second, third, and fourth child coming back from the university and Mark and Margaret being able to just put them back in their bedrooms without any real increased costs. But then Keynes said, but at a certain point, right, aggregate demand, as it continues to move out and the economy continues to recover, there actually will be a place where costs go up. And so this equilibrium point of, say, Y3 and PL3, you finally see an increase in costs as a result of increased aggregate demand, and that's because they've gone beyond the spare capacity, which is just like when the first grandchild was born. And that whole thing continues, right, until you get to a point of, say, right here, AD2, YF, and that this price level going all the way across the screen here, right, PL, 6, doesn't matter, right? And when you reach this, that means that, the house is full. I'm sorry, not only the house is full, but Mark and Margaret have expanded as much as they possibly can. They have filled up all the potential growth possibilities of their house, their land. And that is when, all of a sudden, the economy is back at a level where any increase in demand, say out to here, will lead to only to inflationary pressure, right? Only to inflationary pressure. That they can't do anymore. And so it's just going to cost them more and more and more and more, okay? Because they can't actually have more output. Okay, so let me clean that up a little bit. Take a look at this next graph. And you can see in a very clean way that each child coming back leads to no cost, to increased cost to Mark and Margaret, yet that the real output in like the output of their household is the same. And so this is those factories being built back up that were already in place as the result of the expansion of the economy in the beginning and the building up of industrial might and the investment in capital during the original boom. And then all of a sudden, as demand continues to increase, now we're seeing increased costs up to the fact that we get to here. And then when we get up to 84, of course, it's just inflationary pressure as demand goes beyond or because we've reached the full employment level of output, which would be where the aggregate supply curve in the Keynesian model goes perfectly vertical. Okay, so that's just a cleaner view of what I was saying about Mark and Margaret. And I hope that whole story of Mark and Margaret really helps you visualize what Keynes was talking about. Because the beginning of Keynes' story is actually here. It's when the economy has already built itself up and then it crashes. And then because it's already at one point been built up, then each incremental change is just filling up that spare capacity until there is some increased cost, and then you get to the vertical part. Okay, so all of that is based on this idea that you have a firm understanding of the story of Mark and Margaret. Okay, and if you don't, go back and listen to the little parable of Mark and Margaret again, and it might help you. Okay, so the way that you may want to begin drawing the Keynesian aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve might be something like this. Okay, and I tell my students like, hey, if you draw it like this is this intercept right here of YF, right where it begins the perfectly vertical portion of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. This portion of this curve is actually equivalent to the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so maybe you could sort of draw the beginning of the story here at PL1 and YF. So this is the basic Keynesian model from the beginning. Okay, then there's a crash and then it built back up. Okay, so all of that with love and joy and happiness and your fond memories of how Mark and Margaret, starting off on their life together, taught you about Keynesian economics. I hope you found this video to be helpful, and we'll talk to you in a bit.